Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Maura Oche. I'm the Director of Education at the New Britain Museum of American Art. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture by Dr. William L. Coleman, Old Objects and New Audiences, the Hudson River School Today, which is the third in a series of lectures related to the exhibition, The Poetry of Nature, Hudson River School Landscapes from the New York Historical Society, on view at the NBMAA through May 22nd. Poetry of Nature has been made possible by the generosity of many. First, we extend our gratitude to the staff of the New York Historical Society for their generous collaboration, and to exhibition curator and director emerita of the New York Historical Society Museum, Dr. Linda Ferber, for creating this beautiful presentation of Hudson River School paintings. The NBMAA exhibition is generously supported by the Catherine Cox Special Exhibitions Fund. Additional support is provided by the Bailey Family Fund for Special Exhibitions and Special Exhibition Fund donors, Marion and Russell Burke and John N. Howard. The Poetry of Nature programs are made possible by John M. and Sandra L. Jazowski, the Tomaso family, in memory of Jim Tomaso, and Connecticut Humanities. Additional support for programs is provided by Sharon and David Jepson, Allison and Jay Bambara, Donna and Michael Casella, Kelly and Jonathan Jarvis, and Ken Cariffa and Mark Garavel. In-kind support was provided by Thomas Mack Interiors, whom we thank for the exhibition's beautiful wall colors. And we are grateful to our members and patrons for your continued support of the New Britain Museum of American Art. Dr. William L. Coleman is Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the Olana Partnership, which manages the 250-acre estate and house museum of Frederic Edwin Church in Hudson, New York, alongside New York State Parks. Dr. Coleman co-curated the 2020-21 exhibition, Cross-Pollination, Heed, Cole, Church in Our Contemporary Moment, which was magnificent, and traveled to 4 other venues nationwide. He has been a fellow of the Smithsonian Institution and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and has published a variety of scholarship on 19th century art, architecture, and music. A Q&A will follow the talk, so please submit questions to be answered at the end by Dr. Coleman. Now, it's a pleasure to have Dr. Coleman speak to us today. So welcome, William, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Mara. Thank you all for spending a portion of your weekend with us here today. It's not just kissing up to my host to say that I'm really a great fan of the New Britain Museum of American Art. So I put some heart into this one. I'm going to share some reflections on this art form that brings us together today, this institution and this exhibition that bring us together. And hopefully, because we all sort of care about this stuff, care about this place, we can afford also to think critically and rigorously about some of the challenges coming to this material in the 21st century as a part of a larger reckoning in the museum community, in art history, in the world. So I'm going to share some provisional thoughts from where I'm sitting. I'm honored to follow in the footsteps of some other great speakers in this series. First of all, to be speaking in the context of the work of the great Linda Ferber, one of my heroes, an exhibition that is rigorous and thoughtful and broadens the lens a bit, as we all need to do. So that is first and foremost the most helpful context to work with here. But also speaking after Betsy Kornhauser and Victoria Johnson, 2 friends and colleagues who have provided a kind of pretext for what I'll share, a foundation, and I'm sort of assuming that we're generally familiar with what they've shared. Very briefly, Victoria Johnson shared some of her pioneering work on scientific ways of looking at land, of knowing the landscape, and little glimpses of a project in process of hers that I've been helping in the background that will be very exciting coming a few years down the road. So she was a great choice for this series. an important contributor to the field of 19th century American art. Betsy Kornhauser, the keynote for the series, quite rightly, has given so much to this field over the years and has brought a really thoughtful set of new approaches for new audiences, as my title has it. And her lecture gave a really helpful general overview and critical underpinnings for this idea of Hudson River School. So I'm not going to go much into the limitations of that term. And I know there are some people in museums and universities who don't really like this brand name. It's so widely understood. The general audiences who love this stuff know that brand name and come to see it in museums. I don't think it's really a battle worth fighting anymore to get into the nomenclature. It's widely understood. It's a really nice problem to have, that people love this stuff so much and know it by a less than perfect label. So I'm not going to go into that too much. I will look forward, and maybe that's the contribution I can make to this series as a member of a generation that is trying to bring some new approaches to this stuff in the context of some interesting challenges out there that I'd like to share with you. Hopefully this will not be inside baseball of the inner politics of museums and art history. It's certainly stuff that we in those kinds of institutions think about a lot, but I think they really matter for understanding the American Republic in general, how we got to where we are, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And fundamentally, I'd like to suggest some ways of taking landscape painting seriously. This was maybe the first contribution that this so-called Hudson River School made, an argument for the seriousness of landscape painting, that it could convey religious, allegorical, indeed political messages, despite being seemingly neutral and pretty and decorative and simple. I think that learning to read these objects in the ways that their creators intended, and also reading them against the grain of their creator's intention, only makes exhibitions like the Poetry of Nature more interesting and more valuable. The feeling I always have when I go to the New Britain Museum of American Art is not pleasant relaxation, but invigoration. And this show has invigorated me. I see new ideas percolating, and I'll hope to share some of those ideas with you today. The broader category for these brief remarks, just 40 minutes or so with plenty of time to discuss later. So please do feel free to throw questions into the Q&A function. I'll be glad to go into that later. The broad category would be reception history, not so much the creation history of objects like the one on my title slide here, chosen for a good reason I'll get to, but rather how these objects have spoken to their multiple audiences over the decades and centuries. As I keep alluding, there are some really interesting kinds of course corrections, we might say, if not overt crises, happening in the field of 19th century American art history right now. I'll just give a few little peeks at what I'm seeing, speaking as a member of this generation that is reckoning with this stuff and trying to help these things we love dearly, to which we've devoted our lives, continue to speak to new audiences who bring understandable new demands of their civic institutions, of their museums. So our title slide here today, perhaps you saw this incident that instantly made a lot of art historians perk up. We love it when these objects that we find so fascinating enter into the wider realm. And this was a great example of the ways in which landscape painting is not neutral. It never was. It was always a product of its time, commenting on contemporary events, helping people to understand a complicated country, defining itself against other peoples who were already on this land, against threats from within and without. And this object, presented by Republican Senator Roy Blunt to President Biden at the recommendation of First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, at the inauguration is a 19th century American landscape painting by Robert Selden Duncanson, an African-American artist of that movement, one of the pioneers who did not have the same access to the corridors of power that the artists we are most accustomed to talking about, but nonetheless a really important and accomplished artist who made this remarkable work, Landscape with a Rainbow from the Smithsonian American Art Museum, 1859. And as I understand it, I dug into this a little bit for this context. It was Dr. Jill's recommendation. She named this object. She thought it would be an appropriate symbolic gift, that is a loan really, from the Smithsonian American Art Museum to the White House. A significant recognition of that moment, an effort to turn a page in American politics, a rainbow, perhaps presaging some reconciliation in our tortured political moment. And how interesting that is by one of these artists who has been consciously excluded from the canon, but is included in the checklist of poetry of nature, a step forward. And one of these artists we need to raise up in contexts like this one, think about how the value judgments of the past were not without their assumptions, biases, blind spots, and offer a new and richer and more nuanced and perhaps more critical account of this movement. While that Hudson River School term is really widely known, another I find revealing to sort of clarify what we're talking about here today, to use a lot of words and then a very few words, romantic realist landscape painting in what is now the United States from roughly 1825 to 1875. There was this peak moment. These artists who may or may not have been aware of each other, may or may not have conceived of themselves as members of any particular school, but were, to the retrospective gaze of historians and museum goers, working in allied ways. A different way of describing that from the curator, Ken Myers, is the landscape boom. So I think about this as a boom that did have a bust, a particular rise in the creation and in the consumption of objects like this one for a period of a few decades in American history that were complicated, as you all know. And a really fascinating thing is happening here in these objects on the walls of poetry of nature. These beautiful, seemingly simple things are coming out of a tortured, brutal, violent, bloody moment in American history. Why are they so empty and quiet? What do they have to do with the looming schism and separatism in the United States? The reckoning with America's original sin of human enslavement. These objects seem so pleasant and peaceful and placid, and yet they're coming out of that time. That's what fascinates people like me about these objects. Their aesthetic distinction is a fundamental part of that. But we are coming to recognize that there are voices from this period that have not been heard adequately. Audiences are recognizing that. Markets are recognizing that. Museums are recognizing that in a variety of ways. So one slide for a few distinct case studies here, a few little moments that I wanted to share with you to give you a sense of as I called it, a course correction currently underway in the field of museum practice in regards to the landscape boom. One is a comment for which I don't have an image. A prominent dealer in the field of 19th century American art of long-standing and great reputation, who will remain nameless, said in no uncertain terms, "The market for historical American art is not dying but dead." That was a pretty pessimistic and fascinating comment to me. As a scholar kind of standing outside the market, I see ups and downs and ebbs and flows over the years. Tastes change and shift. There's that 19th century moment where there's so much demand for these things, followed by a rapid fall off and a rejection of these things. It takes almost until the 1950s and 60s for there to be a return of interest. And then maybe we're seeing another, something like a decline in interest right now. So that was interesting. And the market is a part of this, the market that allowed for the creation of these objects in the first place, and the market that is setting a kind of value on these objects today. The second case study is illustrated by my left image here, which is an installation shot of the wonderful Francis Liebman Loeb Art Center at Vassar College, which is not so far from my home institution in the Hudson Valley of New York, a place I really love, a remarkable case study of an institution founded around a collection of painting from the landscape boom. The collection of Elias Magoon, purchased by Matthew Vassar as instructional aids for the young college. They have this legacy collection that's a really interesting part of their story. And I've been advising them on the side, working with their student docents. And I was fascinated to hear from one of these student docents leading tours of that gallery that some of the students, some of the younger generation now are encountering these galleries, avoid them altogether. Go to other parts of the museum where they can relate to the objects more fully, but they feel these things are not fully relevant. The current generation of undergraduates at that fine institution of higher education. So that was like a canary in the coal mine moment to somebody who specializes in this stuff. We who are the choir that I am preaching to, we who care about lectures in conjunctions with interesting exhibitions about the Hudson River School, may be surprised to hear this, but we should be aware that this stuff does not speak to everyone. In this case, these galleries are currently 100% the work of dead white men. And that's a part of the story that has been problematic. The canon has been uniformly white and male. These objects do include really remarkable things. I'll give a little pointer shout out to one there that will return later. Jasper Francis Cropsey with one of his characteristic subjects at Greenwood Lake. There are remarkable things in these spaces worthy of preservation, worthy of continuing to learn from, but they are not speaking equally to all audiences today. A further one that was really interesting to see was the deaccessioning of the painting at top right from the Newark Museum of Art. This is Thomas Cole's The Arch of Nero, one of the icons of that institution. It was purchased by a pioneering curator of American art there in the 1950s, as I mentioned, right when the taste for this stuff is coming back. So this was a really early, foresighted acquisition. I think we all are generally aware of the kinds of associations of Nero, the cliche of the decadence of the Roman Empire, fiddling while Rome burns, all that good stuff. And this is explicitly an allegory of imperial decadence, a comment on the decadence of the American Republic and its original sin of slavery. It was a complicated, rich allegorical painting that was the centerpiece of those galleries for many decades, and they sold it. So that was really shocking to me. It's the kind of object that could be really useful in bringing new approaches to those galleries and thinking about how these paintings by artists of a different time and place who had very different values than we do today offer us as the heirs of history ways of understanding this complicated period, ways into the past. So that was a really shocking moment. And happily, there's a kind of a happy ending here in two cases. One more slide to show some follow-up. Vassar is doing really wonderful work to bring new approaches, indeed new technologies to those galleries, new interpretation, my hope, new acquisitions as well, to tell a fuller story of the history of the time. This is a still from their virtual tour that you can click through at your leisure, see some of those objects up close. You can read the labels by clicking those little tabs within this tool called Matterport that a lot of museums have been finding helpful during the pandemic. So there are good signs that they're working to shake up those legacy galleries. They're bringing in training for their student docents to help them speak with nuance about these objects that are such an important part of their history. And then at right, where the Arch of Nero hangs now, this is not the galleries of the Newark Museum of Art. This is the Philadelphia Museum of Art, with one of the longest labels you'll ever see in an art museum, which makes no mention of Newark or deaccessioning, but just completely a really thoughtful statement of the always already political nature of this object. This is what I'm hoping to see more of. And this is heartening. The great Kathy Foster in that wonderful museum, not so far from the people of Newark who had their patrimony taken from them. There in this gallery, in dialogue with some other really rich objects in the period, do we see a head-on tackling of the stakes of this work, thanks to the generosity of Diane DeMel Jacobson, who's put it on a long-term loan there. So all is not lost. There's reason for hope. There are strategies like these we're seeing in Vassar and the Philadelphia Museum of Art that are applicable also to places like New Britain, which is doing really interesting and inspiring work. This will be just a kind of glimpse into some of these possibilities going forward, some of these stories that are on the walls of poetry of nature, but may be less familiar to you, and things that I hope we will all demand of our institutions going forward. So one approach to bringing these objects to contemporary audiences and helping them to speak to the demands of a museum visiting public that wonders if these things still matter, and if so, how they still matter, has been what scholars call ecocriticism. And I show you the cover of the exhibition catalog for a recent project that is the premier case study of a kind of eco-critical museum exhibition, Nature's Nation, American Art and Environment, which was at, let's see if I can remember, the Peabody Essex Museum, the Princeton University Art Museum, and the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. I believe that was the full tour schedule. It was a fascinating project, and it asked this kind of overarching question: how do these pretty, seemingly simple landscape paintings relate to the state of the natural world then and now? How can we understand these objects in a time of climate emergency, when looking at pretty little paintings might seem irrelevant to some audiences? So that was a really helpful step forward. It's a really tempting step forward for museums, because it valorizes the existing canon by making the artists of this movement environmentalists avant la lettre. And that's not always a mantle that fits neatly. It's certainly interesting to think with, thinking about how these historic American artists were responding to rapid changes in the land, extraction of natural resources, and the sometimes uncomfortably close contact between their pretty little pictures and the despoliation of the landscapes they depicted. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. So that's a really interesting angle. That's something that has opened up some new possibilities. I don't think it's the end. I don't think it's sufficient by itself. It's certainly one necessary approach. That cover of Nature's Nation also gives another approach, which has been contemporary artworks in dialogue with historic. What you have there on the cover of the exhibition as the kind of quintessence of its concerns is a Valerie Hegarty artwork in which she shows a kind of a Bierstadt, Albert Bierstadt composition looking like Yosemite, Bridal Veil Falls perhaps, decaying, crumbling to the floor of the gallery. All this is part of the artwork there. As the landscape itself is under threat, so perhaps the landscape's representation is suffering from environmental loss and change. So that's productive. Another of these I saw recently is in the galleries of the Brooklyn Museum, in which we have a Thomas Cole, Catskill Mountain House at left, a Frederic Church at right, and then in the middle, a Lorna Simpson video work that also hones in on the botanical specificity of the natural world. If you say you can't really see what's going on in this image very well, I'd have to agree with you. And this is a challenge, because to make that video projection work in this space, the gallery had to be really dark. And I, who am a devoted student of Cole and Church and this whole complex movement, found it pretty difficult to see the paintings I'd come to see. So that was challenging. I have to say, again, zooming out to flatter my host here, I can think of two particular case studies that the New Britain Museum has done with contemporary engagements with historic art that have been really useful. And I've told others about them since. Most of all, the fascinating polemical labels that accompanied the 2020 exhibition for America, paintings from the National Academy of Design, in which contemporary artists, many of them of indigenous heritage, had included their own labels in this exhibition, responding very directly to some of these 19th century objects. And that was really fascinating and productive. And we might not have agreed with all of the comments on those really powerful labels that you don't see that often in museums, but they really did spark dialogue and offered an exciting way forward. Another of these that you may recall instantly, because I believe it's now on a permanent display there, is the Titus Kaphar, Javan and the Unknown Gentleman, contemporary artist responding to a colonial portrait, not a landscape, I confess, but an example of a commissioned artwork tackling a really racist object in the permanent collection of a great American museum. That has been a helpful dialogue too. That's one way to help people to tackle the past, give people a kind of permission to be critical of historic art. And that, I would argue, is a kind of taking it seriously, the bare minimum we can do. If these things have any value at all, it's that they are aesthetically distinguished products of their time that help us to understand a different time and space and experience in American history. And finding ways to keep these objects available to the public, open to critique, open to the new demands of new audiences is valuable. Any strategy that gets us there is valuable. So I'm excited about those possibilities. There is this underlying challenge to our enterprise in museums as museum goers, as curators of exhibitions about the landscape boom. Museums purport to be places that make authoritative aesthetic judgments, that they preserve for perpetuity that which is best that has been made. And our blind spots are becoming apparent there. It has become really clear that the people making those decisions were often choosing people who looked like them, that not everybody had the same access to influential patrons, influential sale environments, the academies and institutes where artists found acclaim and buyers. And this should have been apparent to us sooner, but it is something that is a really foremost concern for the field today. Museums need to find that new place of cultural meaning and indeed cultural authority, while that canonical perspective on a movement that has been in the past uniformly white and male in its preservation history, that it was not in its creation history. So we're working to tell some of those stories of the other artists of this time and space who were making works of aesthetic distinction. We are completely debunking the notion that, oh yeah, the reason why you don't hear about artists of color is that they weren't any good at painting. That's a hurtful lie. And I'll share some of the work with you that shows that to be the case. And evidence from the period of when you do a blind prize giving, surprising things happen. So we're going to debunk that notion. I'm going to get to some of these other blind spots here a little bit later. High and low. That the only things that are worthy of preservation in a great American art museum are high art, the best, the stuff that had that institutional seal of approval from the Academy with a lowercase a. That is the tastemakers, even without official titles, the patrons and so forth, who made a decision what was worthy of display and preservation. Things that were outside the urban elite, that is vernacular art, country practice. We sometimes talk about folk folk art has also been overlooked. Amateur professional is another of these big blind spots. There, a key concern is the art of women, who in this period very commonly did not have the ability to practice art as a full-time profession. There are fascinating exceptions to that, but as a rule, that was most common. And getting into the idea of amateur painting practice as a aesthetically distinguished, worthy, really rich area of study is another powerful route forward. There will be more of these kinds of blind spots coming up a little bit later, but I'll put a pin in that topic for now. The hope here is that with exhibitions like the Poetry of Nature, with great forward-looking, community-serving museums like the New Britain Museum of American Art, institutions will do the even harder job of not just bringing in contemporary artists to do that work for them. There's certainly a place for that, and contemporary dialogues have been really productive in my own work, and I really value it. But there's a much harder job that we're just starting, which is dealing with the complexity of the past on its own terms, finding those stories that have been hidden by accident or on purpose, things that have been excluded very deliberately from our official narratives. So I'll just briefly share some of those exclusionary practices, those decision-making processes that have given us a less than complete understanding of that period, 1825 to 75, this surge in romantic realist landscape painting practice, as a kind of a context for what I hope will be visits from all of you to this fascinating exhibition in New Britain. So what were these corridors of power I keep talking about? Just two here, but I'll mention one for which I wasn't able to find a ready image first. I mentioned the idea of an academy with a lowercase a. We talk a lot about academic art, that is things that are officially sanctioned, made by people who have professional training in art making. And there is a fascinating academic history in this country of the kind that we more commonly associate with Britain and France, where you have a long established tradition of very rigid academy structures. Let's pause. The first of these academies in this country that is a key context for understanding the full complexity of the landscape history of this moment is the American Academy of Fine Arts. Not shown here, I'm underlining, but an institution that we understand was really influential in this period from roughly, let's see if I can do it from memory, I think it was about 1825 to 41 with the existence of this institution. And this was led by, for many years, the arch establishment painter, Colonel John Trumbull, who you may know from the famous painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. From a grand old family of Connecticut, the quintessential privileged painter, establishing this position to determine who's in and who's out. Has annual exhibition context, does offer some study, some training in art making for its students. People like Thomas Cole, who's usually in our received narrative where this landscape boom begins, were members of the American Academy of Fine Arts. We're selling paintings to Colonel John Trumbull. We're coming up in that official academic structure. And that context is really important to understand why their paintings look the way they do, what audience they were serving, and also to underline that not everybody had this access to Colonel Trumbull and the American Academy of Fine Arts. That was an exclusionary organization that was uniformly white and male, as was in this period the National Academy of Design, which is shown at left there. Still exists. I mentioned that great exhibition I found really productive to think with that New Britain hosted in 2020 for America. Paintings from this wonderful collection, many of them diploma paintings presented by members of the National Academy when they rose to membership. So through that requirement that you present a painting when you become an official academician, with the letters NA after your name, they've built up an astonishing collection over the years. So this was the rival to the National Academy. This was the left wing, the liberal, the New Guard. People like Cole resigned from the American Academy to join up with the NAD. People like Frederic Church are elected as the youngest ever associate member and then full member. Prodigies of this new cultural elite, but an elite nonetheless. It was not open to all. When we talk about artists of color starting to find acclaim and recognition, it's not through institutions like this one, almost without exception, but there's always some exception in these cases. Now, Wright is another institution that's important to understand how we get to these canons that we're dealing with today, CANON, the received highlights, the assumptions about what objects are best, what artists are best and most important. This is not an academy. This is a studio building, a place where anyone who was anyone had a place to make and sell work, the 10th Street Studio Building, a really important artistic milieu of the 19th century, where people like Frederic Church, Albert Bierstadt, and then getting outside of primarily landscape practice, William Merritt Chase, the Great Society portrait painter, would have their grand showpiece studios. Maybe you can get a little sense here from the scale of the horse and carriage against the first floor, how high these ceilings were. They were grand, beautiful spaces. And the artists who occupied them would fill them with accoutrements of their practice. They would be making an explicit branding argument to a potential buying public about the work their work is doing. For Bierstadt, for example, he was filling his studio at 10th Street with Native American art and artifacts. Fascinating. And we'll get to that problematic shortly, but hanging a Tlingit blanket from the Pacific Northwest in one case, high on these grand walls, as a kind of argument that through buying a Bierstadt painting, you were getting anthropologically rigorous insight into the peoples of the American West. Beneath this is an assumption that the artists at 10th Street, the artists who had access to powerful patrons and the big city buying elite, were able to document for you a people and a culture that were inevitably passing into history before our very eyes. That is the kind of language that people like Bierstadt or George Catlin would have used. So through buying a painting, you can engage in a preservationist impulse, even as this rapidly advancing society was forcing Native peoples of this country from their lands. So that's one of these core challenges in this landscape boom, representations of Native peoples for a buying public that was responsible for displacement. Now to Cole. So I mentioned the problem of the representation of Native peoples. We have this kind of fascinating object where tiny little figure at the heart of this iconic painting by Thomas Cole that I've still never been able to see in person because it's in a private collection. I would love to see it someday, but an early work by that pioneering painter of this great scenic wonder of the Catskills you can still visit today. He includes this staffage figure, as art historians call it, as a kind of cue to see this as a view before the arrival of Europeans, a quote unquote pure wilderness. And so this is a cue to us to understand that these objects are making really explicit choices in what they include in the picture. This is another pictorial lie. We know that in this period, there was a building right here at the top of the falls that would only turn on the waterfall for you if you paid a fee. This was an intensely colonized, civilized, touristed landscape when Cole painted it. And he effaces all of that. And he allows us the romance of thinking back to an indigenous past for our own viewing pleasure in the implicitly white and male 19th century. So that was a really tricky object to think with. My own institution, Olana, has another Cole with a Native figure at its heart, Solitary Lake in New Hampshire. And we try to reckon with that challenge head on the problem of just displaying up another person's lived experience as a kind of exotic flavor in an American landscape painting. All too common, really challenging. At right, we get again to Bierstadt. I mentioned how he's branding himself as the painter of the American West. He's using Native American art often to do that. Bierstadt is really fascinating to me as an example of one of those canonical, powerful artists who makes really clear and unavoidably explicit the complicity of the landscape boom in the despoliation of the landscapes it depicted. So case in point here, making images of Donner Lake from the summit, multiple compositions here made for the railroad baron who was driving a train through the heart of that landscape. Proud of the snow sheds he was erecting to keep avalanches off the tracks. And he asked Bierstadt to have his cake and eat it too, make an image of this beautiful scene that harmonizes with the intrusion of industry that will rapidly bring thousands and thousands of visitors from the east to this landscape, changing it forever. So Bierstadt does that time and again. He's doing this delicate dance with the timber barons, the railroad barons, who are looking to this landscape not for aesthetic uplift, not for the divine and the natural world, the pantheistic worldview that we often understand as coming to us via Wordsworth to Emerson through to Cole, Church, Bierstadt, and beyond, but rather looking with resource extraction and the displacement of native peoples as a core modus operandi. It was necessary that this landscape be presented as empty and waiting to be made useful, and Bierstadt was happy to be the one who delivered on that. Asher B. Durand, Progress. Again, I'm showing us first the canonical painters who are in many cases included in this wonderful exhibition so that we can ask the hard questions about these objects that they deserve. These objects are beautiful. They are painted with great mechanical dexterity. They are really intellectually stimulating, but they are also in many cases inexcusably, unmistakably racist and really challenging for a 21st century viewer, as we've heard from some of those case studies that I shared earlier on. So Progress, a pretty picture that has now landed in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, where it commands a whole wall and has a good, long, thoughtful interpretive panel next to it. They're doing what they can with it. It's an allegorical landscape. It's not a picture of any one observable view in the natural world. It's not strictly realist in that way. It is visionary. And what Durand is visioning here is the progress of civilization on a Euro-American model. The telegraph poles, the smoke of steamships and industry, the spread of the railroad and carts and agriculture. And you will have already noticed native peoples being pushed away, cloaked in shadow at the far left in the wilderness, as civilization, as they conceived it, inevitably marches onward. This is, again, a compositional cliche of this period. Durand makes it pretty. Durand delivers on a really high level what others would do in a cruder way. More on that later, but do keep this kind of Durand in mind when you look to the remarkable Durands that are in this exhibition. These kind of rigorously interior forest scenes, zooming in on a single tree and its bark and its foliage. They're kind of aesthetic images that are unlike any others. They're boring in a way. They don't give you these great recessions into space, but force you to confront one plant. So look to that on the checklist of this exhibition. There's some remarkable things included. So for the prettification of Durand to the overt propaganda and crude execution of John Gast, this sort of propaganda image makes more explicit the stakes of an image like Durand's, that part of his project, that which his beautiful pictures are complicit in, where you get this allegorical figure of American progress literally unspooling the telegraph wire across the continent forcing away the native peoples from this land, forcing away the buffalo, bringing agriculture on a Euro-American model, making no mention of what we know to have been millennia of cultivation of the land, encouragement of some crops over others, a dramatic transformation of the American landscape long before Europeans arrived. This is what lies beneath this movement. This is the kind of popular art, if we challenge the high-low distinction, that helps us to understand the stakes of this all a little bit better. So what is missing in these narratives? I'm getting to the end of my time here. Three figures that belie many, many others. I started with Robert Selden Duncanson, shown at left there, an African-American artist who transgressed many borders of this time, found access to markets, even though he has not so often found access to permanent public collections to preserve his work and to tell his story as much as we might like. The New York Historical Society and the New Britain Museum are able to show this artist's work, which is now hugely in demand and hugely costly because everybody's eager to make up for these past blind spots. At right, another artist of color, Edward Mitchell Bannister, fascinating case study I'll come to later. And at middle, this other elephant in the room, women artists of the period. Eliza Pratt Greatorex, one who really fascinates me. I'll share some of her work with you. Greatorex at left there in a private collection, and in a galleries collection here. You'll notice this is commonly the case. These are remarkable objects. They are beautifully executed. They are not of lesser aesthetic distinction than Thomas Cole, who in many cases was a pretty rudimentary painter, even though his work is really interesting. Not the most gifted draftsman in many cases. We're willing to overlook that because of his own privilege. These are beautiful, remarkable objects by women artists who are forcibly carving out a path for themselves, even though not a one held a studio at 10th Street, even though not a one in this period was a member of the National Academy of Design. Eliza Pratt Greatorex spawns a dynasty of female artists. Her daughters become artists as well. Julie Hart Beers at right, that middle name mentions another path into this really closed and incomplete art world, part of a family of artists. William Hart is another famous Hudson River School painter. So she's able to find a way in with beautiful works like The Quiet Brook through that training she gained in her own home. Duncanson and Bannister, using this language of romantic realism to respond to the blind spots of their time. Cincinnati from Covington, Kentucky, 1851, a view across the slave and free line, an African-American figure in the foreground, and we're able to look out to a free state in the distance. The subtext is immediately clear. At right, Edward Mitchell Bannister, this is one I alluded to earlier. What happens when we do a blind exhibition review? What happens when jurying for display ignores race? Surprising things happen, and we learn that our value judgments are not so consistent over the years. Under the Oaks is now lost, unfortunately, but we know that this painting of 1876 was shown at the Philadelphia World's Fair, the Centennial Exposition, and awarded first prize. And this shocked the jurors when they found out what the painter looked like. It was a controversy. There were some who tried to withdraw that medal, but he prevailed. A rare little breakthrough in this period that is the exception that proves the rule, that there are many, many more stories like this one that are not being told. Very briefly here, one of the kinds of privilege that these canonical artists obtained was a privilege of the domestic, looking at landscape through inhabitation. Thomas Cole lives in the landscapes of the Catskills and makes this particular canvas, which is in your exhibition. So I had to mention that, what happens when you live in this view. Albert Bierstadt at left, Jasper Francis Cropsey at right, artists in this great institution who are inhabiting the similar landscape, building houses on a monumental scale and knowing landscape by that means in a very particular way that not all had access to. Cropsey making these intensive repeated views of Greenwood Lake, like the one I pointed out in Vassar's galleries, that particular mode of Hudson River School practice that feels characteristic to us all as we look at objects like this one, only possible because he owned a grand old country house in this view. That transmission of a domestic ideal from the first generation Cole to Frederic Church, who I must discuss as I work at the Great Church Museum, is really direct and deliberate. Church responding to Cole's own home place, designing and making one of his own, this iconic Orientalist fantasy palace on a hill at the heart of 250 acres he designed and laid out, landscape art in 3 dimensions. The house there is at the heart of this landscape. This is the ultimate example of the privilege of the artistic power elite in the 19th century. Not everyone could make a masterpiece of landscape art like this one in 3 dimensions, but because this collection and this artist preserved so much else, it does help us to address some of these blind spots. It gives us ways forward for the eco-critical. Paintings like Frederic Church's views of the Hudson Valley in Winter from Olana have been used to prevent the construction of a nuclear power plant directly in the middle of this view. They've played a really direct role in environmental debates. The global collections of this remarkable museum also help to raise up stories that have been less well preserved, which is one of our goals at Olana today, to bring in these women artists and artists of color from the 19th century, not only through contemporary artist dialogues, which is also a very productive angle, new context for the work of somebody like Frederic Church, all that made this kind of privilege possible. What lies beneath in this collection is all kinds of other blind spots, and this will be my final note here. One assumption in looking to this work and trying to share it with a broad general public has been painting above all. Photography, drawing, all these other media, and indeed popular media, are very important to this and are preserved at places like Olana. A remarkable Arctic stereograph from Olana's collection of the Arctic expedition of Dr. Isaac Israel Hayes, one of very few preserved in the world, does exist in Frederic Church's collection. We can think about that popular 3D viewing technology, not highfalutin landscape painting on a gallery walls, but immersive transport through a lens that makes you feel like you're doing armchair travel. Also of interest to Church, also of interest to us. The panorama, another kind of landscape painting practice that is unspeakable for museums today. But these paintings are competing with these popular visual entertainments, whole room size, entertaining paintings that you step inside to be immersed in another world, in another landscape. This is another key context for our work in museums today. The high-low, the popular, the vernacular, the urban-rural, and then not least the amateur professional. So huge work to be done on amateur artists, particularly women artists, as we learn more and more about the artists of these families. Frederic Church's own daughter, Isabel Downey Church, Thomas Cole's daughter, Emily Cole. So many other stories here, people who did not really have the privilege to practice art professionally, who are part of this really complicated, really rich, and all the more fascinating because of its complexity stew of the 19th century American landscape boom. I hope that this has given you some things to chew over and think with as you visit this wonderful American museum and this really rich exhibition, The Poetry of Nature. These are some of the things that I and my colleagues in museums are thinking about as we try to help these things that we love speak to new audiences that are understandably asking new questions. And I'd be very glad to talk over this range of topics with you now.
Bill, thank you so much. That was just wonderful. It's such a vast topic, and you've given us so much to think about. And before we answer some questions, I do want to share with you that we have just rehung our Valerie Hegarty West Rock with Branches. It's now on view. So another reason to visit the museum for everyone. There is a question in the Q&A. Are you able to see it, Will?
Yes, let's see here. Yeah, please do feel free to send more questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I'd be glad to talk over any of this in the time that remains. Okay, so yeah, I'd be glad to get into that. Ronald F. asks, the market, perhaps this is a phrasing I used, I'd be glad to provide more context for it. The market allowed for the creation of Hudson River School artworks. Absolutely, it's the case. And one of the most interesting things about these choices I mentioned the artists are making at 10th Street is how they're very consciously building that market. So apologies if that wasn't clear. That's absolutely my contention. Places like Olana, places like the 10th Street studio building are consciously forming a market, building an audience expectation, and creating a context for sale. Cole's maybe primary contribution was building this market that he never got to be the complete beneficiary of, and never gets the build on the scale that Frederic Church did. But these artists were consciously cultivating patrons. They were working both on commission and on speculation. There are cases here where we know these artists are not really free to follow their independent genius. That might be the preferred mythology of art history, going back to the Italian Renaissance, that these people are making exactly what their inner drive dictated to them. They're above the fray of the messiness of money and markets. That's very much not the case in this period. These are fascinating artist businessmen who are hand in glove with a technocratic elite that is rapidly changing the country. And they are cultivating that audience, teaching them to want landscape paintings and making things that only that elite could buy, paintings 10 feet wide in many cases.
Will, there are a few in the chat. Are you able to pick up the chat?
Let's see here. We've got I'm happy to get into it, Polly. Not at any time was I degrading any white artists in this remark, so you may have misheard me there. It's a challenging moment in museums, and we're trying to find what is worthy of preservation, while also doing these objects the basic service of taking them seriously. I wrote my dissertation about Thomas Cole. I work at the Great Museum of Frederic Church. I love these objects. I'm really fascinated by these people. I would love to have a meal with them and to talk over the topics on which we agree and disagree. We are history's heirs, and it is certainly the case that that time was very different from our own, that these objects are doing things that are complicated, challenging, a little bit uncomfortable from our current moment. And my hope, and I hope you'll join me in this hope, Polly, is if we take these things seriously, we don't want them to be relegated to storage for that reason. We want them to remain available to a broad general public, a thoughtful modern education department like the one Maura is running, to ask hard questions of them, and to invite new dialogue. That's all of our hope in this field of art history and museums, that in a time when we've lost the ability to talk with each other, that museums can be a place of light in the darkness where we have challenging conversations, where we deal with the messier parts of our history, and we get into the stuff that really matters. That's my hope. Let's see what else here. Jessica, I'm not sure I fully understand. There seems to be an influence in this direction from grants and other outside funding, which again represents the perspective of an elite group of people. If I understand you correctly, I think you're talking about the 21st century context for trying to help these things speak to new audiences, that those 21st century interventions like Nature's Nation, that exhibition I mentioned, are certainly funded by major granting agencies. And people like me do have to respond to the demands of those funders to a certain extent. We are all trying to carve out that path, just as these artists were in the 19th century, who might have felt an inner drive to create, but also needed to feed their family at the end of the day. We try to find that happy medium between the two. So there is a rising generation, of which I'm proud to be a member, that is trying to offer marketable, thoughtful, engaging, interesting, inspiring, uplifting exhibitions that don't hesitate to ask difficult questions, that bring in voices that were not always welcome, that show you that favorite painting you already know, but maybe some things that might become your next favorite painting. That's the hope.
Lots more in the chat and the Q&A both.
Let's see, I'll pick up one from Sharon Mosenkis. was building Olana in part a marketing move? I absolutely think that it was. And this is a really rich part of that place because it is so well preserved. We have the ability to understand exactly the values that went into making it. We can read it against the grain. And we can sort of understand the choices that went into it. We can picture the visitor experience. If you would have come to Olana as a potential buyer for a Frederic Church painting, we can imagine how you would have moved through that grand main house after the sweeping landscape that immerses you in that artist's vision. You see that this is a person of taste and refinement who has expended great labor and money on shaping in 3 dimensions the kinds of values and compositions you could purchase and bring home with you in oil on canvas. So I do see Olana as a very explicit claim on a market's attention, and we see that in the 19th century critical response. Period art critics were talking about this amazing place Mr. Church has built. It was, to a certain extent, open to visitors of privilege who were able to come and see for themselves this remarkable earthwork, a kind of landscape art across media. So yes, I think that was an important part of making it. Let's see what else here. Is there any room for artists simply wanting to present the landscape on its own terms and not with social, political, or other newsworthy commentary? So I want to dig into that a little bit, and I want to understand exactly what we're talking about. Is landscape painting ever neutral? Was landscape painting in a period when the United States was defining itself amidst brutal conflict neutral? Was a painting like Sanford Robinson Gifford's The Coming Storm, painted in 1860, neutral? So is it the case that any landscape painting ever can be completely cut off from the politics of the society in which it was created and consumed? No, I don't think it can be. That is not to say that every artist working in the world is working explicitly with that as their primary driver. But part of our reason for taking these things seriously in museums and in the academy is that through spending time with them, letting them speak to us slowly, not in the ways of fast looking we're all often accustomed to on social media, we can understand things that might not have been surfaced for the artist, that it is significant to paint an American scene empty of the people who lived in that landscape for many millennia, to paint an American scene that effaced the very clear and present threat that the nation might not endure in 1860. So those are the case studies that really interest me. I'd suggest reading on that. A book that's been really helpful to me is Eleanor Jones Harvey's The Civil War in American Art, which has a fascinating chapter within it on looking hard at landscape of this period and asking how it relates to that wider conflict. So the answer to your question is both yes and no. If all that concerns us is artist intent, yes, landscape painting can be without politics. If what interests us is afterlives of objects, how they continue to speak, how those who are history's heirs make their own meaning wholly legitimately from the traces of the past, then no, these things are embedded in the culture that produced them. And I think it does these objects honor to ask these hard questions. Let's see. I know we're going a little bit past 4, so if you do need to log off, we won't be offended. I'll stay on a little bit longer. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the good hard questions many of you has asked. I'm happy to tackle them head on, and we may not agree at the end of the day. We may have to agree to disagree. This might have been a quick dip in a cold pool for some folks who have not been living with the challenges of these objects that I have, and for that I apologize. I don't want to make these objects any less pleasurable to you. I hope that I can make them a little more eloquent, that I can help to draw out some of the stories that were always in them, and we just need a different set of tools to read those stories to a certain extent. Appreciate your kind words, Mona. What are some of other modes of viewing these objects anew beyond the case studies mentioned? Eco-awareness, contemporary intervention, et cetera. So this is the ultimate elephant in the room to me. I mentioned that I don't think the eco-critical is sufficient. I don't think that contemporary dialogues are sufficient, although it's a big part of my own job. So obviously I see it as really useful, and I do really dig the Titus Kaphar intervention at New Britain. The harder work is rigorous interpretation, the work of education departments, and indeed, often, most expensively, acquisitions, building out the stories of our galleries by bringing in the women artists that are out there on the market, that are increasingly coming to light, the artists of color who were making really remarkable objects of aesthetic distinction in the same years, but did not have the patrons to donate them to the New Britain Museum of American Art at the end of the day, in most cases. Forward-looking patrons have been helping museums to do this work, fundraising, grants, there are a lot of efforts underway. As I mentioned, this is tough because everybody recognizes this is a huge blind spot. Everybody is now scrambling to make up for lost time and to acquire these objects that are in short supply. But that's my ultimate hope, that we're going to see galleries that have a lot of accession numbers, date of acquisition, starting in about 2020, new efforts to bring in old objects, tackling that history on its own terms with thoughtful, rigorous labels. But that's going to take some time. Done. What others? Any you want to raise up, Maura?
I think you sort of addressed one of the questions in, just now, 2 questions in 1 answer. Looking over at the chat, a lot of thanks for a provocative presentation. Let's see if there's any questions in there. A lot of great comments in the chat.
I'll answer Jay's here. I did say acquisitions in general are a great strategy, but you say acquisitions like mine. Allow me to clarify that that is not a big part of the work of a place like Olana, because it's primarily centered on the historic collections of the church family. However, I can share some news hot off the presses. While we don't go out and buy any old 19th century painting that doesn't have a connection to our founding history, the historic possessions of the church family, we have recently brought in a really exciting trove of work on paper, watercolors by Frederic Church's daughter, Isabel Charlotte, aka Downey Church, who is another of these remarkable, important artists who didn't have the luxury to go pro in it, who was making really beautiful objects that learned from the lessons of her globe-striding father, one of the most famous artists of the period, and made these really sensitive, intimate, we might even say domestic, because unfortunately, that was the realm to which many women were limited in this period, focusing on single plant specimens, single flowers. So they're really beautiful. We're thrilled to have them. We expect to do future exhibitions centering on Downey Church and not just Frederic. Jessica, we can't know the answer to your good question. Was Under the Oaks by Edwin Mitchell Bannister lost on purpose? No reason to believe that. Things go missing all the time, unfortunately. There are a lot of other mysteries I've been seeking out, even by the canonical artists you know well already. So I don't think we can jump to that assumption. It's certainly wholly possible that these artists who did not have the same cultural edifice of preservation around them found it easier for their works to go missing and lost over the years than people like Coleman Church. But because tastes ebb and flow over the years, there's so many of these stories. Even the famous artists, things are being rediscovered all the time. The great example in the 1970s of a monumental Frederic Church painting you wouldn't think could go missing, the icebergs, aka the North, found in an orphanage in the north of England and now on view in the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts. So these things are coming to light all the time.
Wonderful. I think any last questions? We have some great comments. And I thank everyone. Thank you, Will. This has been so thoughtful and really is giving us a new lens. So we appreciate your time and your incredible insights. And we look forward to seeing you at the New Britain Museum of American Art. And to all of the rest of you, thank you very much.
My pleasure, and thank you all for your good questions. Appreciate your attendance.
Good afternoon. Goodbye.